Welcome to the Embellish Podcast, where we like to talk about stories. We like to explore how embellishment makes a story better, how it allows us to connect more deeply with both the person telling the story and the subject of the story. Together we will explore people, products, and places that have a story to tell. We'll navigate through the truths, half-truths, and outright lies and decide if the truthiness even matters. All right, we're going to start that over again because I absolutely had muted my microphone and didn't know that. So thanks for joining us. If you are here, don't see anybody on chat yet, but if you're watching this on the recast, absolutely appreciate it. I've been back and forth over what to call these episodes that are non-centrally focused. A lot of mine have a central focus, whether it be on foundations of distilling or on particular things that distillers do. Gimmicky aging or whatever it is. And so I've decided I think I'm going to start calling these small batch sessions. And they're, a grouping of things that I've kind of tossed together in my head. We're going to talk about them, they're hot takes or whatever you want to call it. And that's going to link into tonight because we actually are going to talk about small batch whiskey. But before that, we'll talk about the last week. Last weekend, I had a couple of weird opportunities to hang out with some folks over the, like people that you've interacted with over the course of your life. Had a chance to visit a friend who was having a housewarming party, and had some people from from elementary school to middle school to high school to college to my first and one of my first jobs to my most recent job. Real weird to have all of those people in the same place, and you're not the central reason why they're there. But it was really good. And then over the weekend, our local university that I went to had homecoming, so I got to see some friends from college and whatnot. And then last night I got to run a tasting for some coworkers. My boss has decided that potentially in the spring I'm going to be doing a tasting for 100 fellow coworkers, and I'm trying to test out a few ideas. And so last night was like an educational tasting, and got a chance to do that. And non-personally related stuff. Something that you might be interested in, and I'll absolutely include a link. I think it's already in the description of this particular episode. Repeal Day Expo's coming up. That's something that Fred Minnick hosts. I attended it last year. It's virtual. It's relatively inexpensive. I think it's like $25 for a regular ticket and $50 for VIPs. There's a handful of folks that I'm really, really interested in seeing. Obviously, everybody that is a part of that will be super fun. Like I said, it is virtual. They use this thing called Deggy World, and as long as you have a moderately decent computer, you'll have an opportunity to get in and interact with folks and have some conversations that you might not be able to have otherwise. I know ADHD Whiskey is slated to be there, and if you're here and you get bored with this, absolutely hop over to his live stream. He's doing his UFC flight night for, I think, the lightweights. Last week's live stream he did was actually had one of the whiskeys that I had sent over to him, which ended up coming in second place, and it's from my friends over at Bourbon Junkies. It was actually Dan's bullet pick. And then tying that in, I'm actually trying out their Starlight that they did in Cognac tonight. Just something new, just came in this week. So far, so good. It's fantastic. But also at Repeal Day Expo will be a Hood Sommelier, which is Jack Bigadoo from Instagram. He's a wealth of knowledge and a fantastic friend. And then Marian Eves, which is one that I'm super excited about being able to see her, give a speech or do something along with. Going back to Hood Sommelier, Jack is hosting a Afrofusion event with Heaven Hill in Louisville on November the 12th. Absolutely be there, but I already have plans for that weekend. But if you've got that, there'll be a link in the description of this video. Absolutely go buy a ticket. Go to that event. He had one the weekend of the Kentucky Bourbon Festival, and aside from a little bit of rain, it was a fantastic event. I don't know what Starlight does to these finished barrels, but they're fantastic. I've got a few of them. I think I've got a Sauternes over here with this cognac, and they're just amazing. And that's a feather in the cap for Indiana whiskey. Oh yeah, and so Indiana Bourbon on Instagram was running a Indiana Awards, and Alan Bishop over at French Lick took I think Bourbon of the Year or something along that lines. I saw where the Lee Sinclair got that. Absolutely well deserved. It's a fantastic whiskey. Well, I think we'll get into the meat of tonight's episode. We're talking about small batch whiskeys. small batch bourbon specifically. And it's, we talked about buzzwords a couple weeks ago in the wordplay episode, and things that people get kind of axle wrapped on. And this is one that whiskey nerds really, really, really get wrapped around. But there's enough content and context here that I figured we would at least have a half of episode worth of it. And the word small batch is on a lot of different whiskeys. If you look at the thumbnail image for this particular video, those are all small batch whiskeys that I own. And they range from Four Roses to Evan Williams, Peerless, and it's this term that the TTB, or the Alcohol, Tobacco Tax Trade Bureau, doesn't have a legal definition for it. Small batch generally is referring to a whiskey that is not vatted or a single barrel, and so vatted is like these huge amalgamations of several hundred barrels to be able to make things. But how do you identify what is a small batch and what should be a small batch? Hey Cheech, thanks for showing up. I see you in the chat there. You must be doing some dual duty there between me and ADHD, so just go watch him. It'll absolutely be better. I know that for sure. No shame in that. So going back to it, small batch whiskey is going to be excluding single barrel. But if you really think about the definition of small batch, a single barrel is the smallest batch that there can be. But it's a non-defined term, and that's what a lot of people get really, really axle wrapped on. Like, what does that mean? Why are they even using that? And I think, at least in modern whiskey terms, it's more of a flavor profile. It's a way that a brand is differentiating one particular offering from another. This is considered to be a small batch version of their offering versus a single barrel versus their traditional offering. And depending on the size of the distillery, can really, change whether or not it is a huge batch or not. And like Peerless, I doubt that they have the ability to make what would be considered a large batch by lot. So everything they do by proxy is going to be a small batch. But we're still absolutely talking about blended whiskey. Like I said, to me, it's a flavor profile. For Four Roses, it's a flavor profile. For Evan Williams, it's a flavor profile. For Michter's, even maybe it's a flavor profile. And one that is I think gaining a little bit of notoriety for me is going to be people like Smoke Wagon and people like Peerless, absolutely, and some of your craft distilleries. Like I've got this Southern bourbon from distillery in Georgia, and it absolutely is going to be small batch. It's going to be made in Georgia. It's going to be, I think it's actually aged in Tennessee potentially, and they're the truest definition. Triple duty. You're running triple duty tonight. They're the truest definition of what small batch is meant to be. Like I said, it's just a flavor profile. It's something that they can build out, but by the standard of being a small distillery, that's what it is. But what happens? Like, should it be regulated? Is this a term that the TTB should take over and start trying to regulate? And you have to ask the question, like, what happens when you decide to put a size constraint or limit? Does that change the outcome? Does that make it a better or a worse whiskey? And I can only think that trying to put it under a legal definition is going to hinder the ability of a distillery to be able to create a positive offering. Because at the end of the day, they're trying to reach a flavor profile. They're trying to reach something that is positive and beneficial to us as consumers. And if we say, to be a small batch, you can only have 20 barrels, right? And if you blend 20 barrels and they're not there, put the 21st barrel in, and now it's no longer a small batch. Can't call it that, because now there is notoriety in the naming of it, but it's one barrel over, and it did hit the flavor profile that you're after. And so, that's one of the impacts that you can have. But then also, like, small is a relative term. It's not necessarily something that is quantifiable easily. So, what makes it small? Is it 10 barrels? Is it 20 barrels? Is it 100 barrels? And if you are a significantly sized distiller, then it's going to be a large quantity of barrels. And if you're a small distiller, then it's going to be a small quantity of barrels. So, then do you say, okay, well, do we make it a percentage, percentage of an average batch? Well, now you're requiring distilleries to, number one, disclose what the size of a normal batch is, and then be able to say, okay, percentage of that's what you get to small batch. Like, it gets really conflated. And if you guys are anything like me, The more that you involve the government, the better everything is always going to be. You know, it's going to result in a much better, more positive outcome if they get involved, for sure, right? So we can just think like let's leave it alone. Let's let the distillers do what they're doing, and if we don't like it, we just don't buy it. It's pretty simple. But then it begs the question, like, why do we even care? And you know, a lot of this comes out of the most whiskey consumers' trust in their brands is very low, or at least your I don't want to call elite, but your 1 or 2% of the whiskey consumption population is really in tune with what distillers are doing, what offerings they're going to have. They're, you know, we're looking at labels that are going to be offerings, you know, 6 months from now, or a year from now, or 2 years from now. We're not just walking in and looking at a wall of whiskey and saying, oh, I like the shape of that bottle and the label that's on it, I'm going to buy it. Or, hey, this one has a horsey on the top of it, this is the thing that I want. We're looking farther down it. And so we care because we feel like the term can be misleading to those consumers that come in. But if they're not actually being injured, you know, like that's one reason we can't care. But if they're not actually being injured, they're buying something, they're enjoying it, and they're moving on. Do they even notice or care about the small batch thing? You know, I had an interesting interaction while I was at the Ragnar Bourbon Relay that was done between Bardstown, Danville, and up into Lexington a couple weeks ago. One of the runners in our group, you know, Wilderness Trail, had opened up their distillery and they were selling single barrels out of it. It was a single barrel specifically selected for this race, and his reaction was like, you know, we were standing there and we went inside to buy a bottle, and they're like, oh, we're all out. You know, all of them are out on the shelf. Well, one of the ladies was like, hey, there's one more sitting behind the counter, and so they pull it out and they throw the single barrel label on it, and they sell it to us, and he's like, yeah, I bet this really is a single barrel. And he's really kind of skeptical about it because they had the label on hand. And I said, you know, there's legitimate regulation of what they're allowed to call that, right? That actually is the only barrel. And they probably did have one set back. So it's a real thing. But that type of expectation amongst, you know, whiskey connoisseurs is very, very true. Like, people get really wrapped into like, oh, they're trying to deceive us, or you know, make things tougher for an average whiskey consumer to come in and buy the right thing, or you know, be adequately educated as to what they're trying to purchase. So, you know, like, that can be one reason why we care. The other reason why we care is because we just have to know all the facts. We have to know everything that every distiller is always doing, and I'm not on board with that. So, you know, this small batch term, if we as the whiskey nerds start backing up and saying, hey, this is just a flavor profile that they're particularly calling it, just like they could use the term sour mash on the label. And that's another one that I do want to get into, because I did a little bit of poking around on, you know, the difference between sour mash and sweet mash, and it can have an impact. But, you know, like, what does it really mean, and why is it that way? When they throw it on the label, it talks about a process that they're doing, but at the end of the day, does it impact the average consumer? And so, let's back off the small batch thing. Like, why do we care? We have to stop caring about those things unless they're actually trying to deceive us, or they're trying to say something that is untrue. Like, you know, sourcing. Like, oh, I got this whiskey from another state, but I'm going to say that I distilled it myself. That's legitimately a lie as far as labeling standards are going. Labeling something as a small batch is just an opportunity for them to create a differentiated product on the market. So sour mash, that's another one. Like for us as the whiskey consumers, what does sour mash mean for us in the final flavor? Other than it is different. And to fully understand it, you have to go back and, like, what does sour mash mean? And I think I've talked about it before, and I know a lot of other people have absolutely talked about what sour mash is. But sour mash is basically conditioning a new batch of fermentation with a little bit of leftover or spent mash from a previous distillation process. And a lot of our distillers that will claim that they are doing sour mashing and putting it on their labels, and realistically, most people probably are. Most major distillers are probably sour mashing and just not talking about it. But when you throw sour mash on there, it basically just means that you're leaving a little bit behind from a previous distillation. And historically, that was meant to bring the pH up. You know, controlling your pH has a lot to do with bacteria formation and whether you have what you want in there or what you don't want in there. And if we go back to distilling in the woods, or I don't want to say industrial revolution, but pre-scientific revolution, and understanding like what's chemically actually happening here, they just found that if they left some behind, they came out with a better fermentation process. And not only that, like the distillation process in that time was significantly less efficient, so there's probably still some alcohol left behind. And so re-fermenting and re-distilling is going to result in more pure grain alcohol coming out of the still at a later fact. And then there's the spent mash that can then be used. Some spent mash is used to feed animals, but the reality is that in sour mash it also provides a source, if I remember correctly, it provides a source of nitrogen to the fermentation process. The spent yeast husks create nitrogen in there, then the following fermentation will feed off of that. And so you're just creating a more effective environment. And if you are talking 100 years ago, where basically they were putting things together and it was sort of like witchcraft, like, oh, whatever comes out the other side of the fermentation process is just sheer witchcraft. Like, it's just something that they found over time that worked. But in modern distillation, we have a far greater control over the chemical reaction that's actually happening in there. And so what sour mash is likely doing is a couple things now. Is number one, you don't necessarily have to be as clean to be considered a sour mash. And that doesn't mean that everybody's being dirty. It just means that they're not required to completely clean out a still before they run the next distillation. If you're a huge distiller that's doing a continuous column distilling, you effectively can't be sweet mash because you're just continually pumping it in, and there may be some left over from the previous distillation. Like there's a lot of things that happen there. But there's also this benefit that whenever you feed that spent mash back into the current fermentation, you're recapturing some of the heat. And that's one of the big things. Is like you gotta, if you think you're looking at a 200 gallons still, let's just say 200 gallons, getting 200 gallons of liquid up to temp quickly is pretty difficult, and it's going to be resource intensive. It's going to be energy intensive. It's going to take a while to get that to happen. But if you can take some of that spent mash that's coming out of distillation at over 100 degrees and introducing it, so you're adding in warm liquid as well as external heat, you're able to bring it up to temp much faster and get it into the appropriate fermentation process and get it converting those sugars into alcohol. So there's that benefit. But then you have this, like, these people that are really about sweet mash, and they're starting to talk about that, and this is one thing that I sort of came across. Is like, I have a bottle over here that is, your Michter's sour mash. Michter's has a sour mash, but the Michter's also has a small batch. And my question becomes, like, is Michter's small batch a sweet mash, or is it just not advertising that it is sour mash, or does it really even matter to us? Because at the end of the day, there's a slight difference in the taste. Is one better than the other for me? I'd say probably not. It's just a different method and a different way that they're doing things. And they're clearly identifying the process that occurs there, but they're purporting something like sour mashing to be something somewhat, I don't want to say revolutionary, but it's something worth noting. It is a notoriety. Like, oh, we have a sour mash whiskey. So does everybody else for the most part, because it's a byproduct of distilling at scale. But sweet mash, on the other hand, I think that is a point that someone should really be making as a distiller, that like we're sweet mashing, which means there's an incredible amount of cleanliness that goes from batch to batch to batch to batch. But it also indicates that you're likely going to have more variation from batch to batch as well, because you're now not using some of the same stuff over and over again. And I've always kind of, when craft beer took off, a lot of people really kind of poo-pooed on distillers like Anheuser-Busch or Coors because they're making crap beer. But my dad got into making beer himself, and one of the things that he always fell back to is that if you can consistently make the exact same thing over and over again over thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands of gallons of beer, that's an incredible art form. And using something like sour mashing to be able to continue to produce, Maker's Mark makes a consistently the same flavored product, but they're using, everybody's using a 52-gallon barrel and they're blending them together to get to their final profile. Be able to do that consistently is a feat of kind of dialing everything in. But if you're running in a sweet mash environment, you're adding another barrier to be able to dial in to get consistently reproducible results, because you're cleaning it out. And if you don't clean out exactly right, or you use something slightly different, or you know, whatever it is that you do, you're introducing potential change to the final outcome of whatever it is that you're making. But it boils back to like this idea of, okay, this is a small batch is a useless term and sour mash is a useful term, but it isn't necessarily useful to us as a consumer to understand anything other than the fermentation process. Not even, I guess maybe I keep saying distillation process, but it's the fermentation process. And what benefit is it to us? There's this wonderful article, and I'm going to put a link in my video here that Alan Bishop did over on his Alchemist Cabinet WordPress site about sweet mash versus sour mash. It has a lot of really good information, and he points out pretty clearly something that I agree wholeheartedly with, is there's this like historicity behind the use of sour mash that most modern distillers don't understand, and so they keep using the exact same term, but it doesn't necessarily carry the same weight or the same meaning. Hey Cliff, thanks for showing up tonight, man. Oh man, that one went down the wrong way. It's fantastic. So, where was it? Yeah, so they're using the term without fully understanding using the term. And it, like the sherry butts conversation we had a couple weeks ago, is that, you know, what sherry butts used to be versus what we're using the term as now. They're both very, very different versions of what it is. But you know, that sort of outlines it. Now I'm rolling towards the end of my night tonight. Didn't have a whole lot planned. Just wanted to kind of continue the ball rolling down and see if I can get 30 minutes in and talk about what's going on, what I'm thinking about. I did get some bottles for my next themed episode that I plan on doing. I'm going to try to shoot for Wednesday. It's going to be something I might consider like whiskey adjacent, tangential to whiskey. There is one whiskey involved, but there's a couple of other things that are involved as well. It's Halloween this weekend. I found this great article that was pairings of candy and whiskey, and thought about, kind of following up on that maybe next week and saying, oh, I tried this because I think I had most of them. But we get to take the kids trick-or-treating and then have the parent tax, where we take our portion of their loot for hauling them around, and then maybe we'll put some whiskey pairings together and see what that tastes like after the fact. But like I said, going back to the beginning of the episode, Repeal Day Expo coming up in December. Absolutely buy tickets for that and go watch ADHD Whiskey or Hood Sommelier or Marion Eves. Those will be some fantastic events. Buy the VIP. You might get a chance to do a tasting with somebody. Jack from Hood Sommelier has his Afro Fusion event with Heaven Hill in Louisville in November the 12th specifically. There will be a link to that in my video as well. I think that's all I've got for tonight. So we'll hit it with the rollout, and thank you guys for showing up tonight. Cheech and Cliff, happy to see you guys here tonight. If you ever decide you want to join, absolutely let me know, and I will get you a link. We'll hop on StreamYard or OBS Ninja or something, and you guys can be a part of the conversation anytime you absolutely want to be. So thank you everybody for showing up tonight, if you did, and if you're watching this on the rewatch, absolutely appreciate that. I think we're up to 10 subscribers, which is 10 way more. Yeah, so hey, Cliff, Whiskey Mutant, yes, he is always pairing candy. I've been listening to It's My Bourbon podcast for a while, and they've been doing their pairings. This one was actually an article where they just did 6 or 7 directly ones, and I trust Whiskey Mutant's pairings significantly, but this article, a lot of times it's one of those articles that you come across and you're like, okay, it's like the 10 best whiskeys, and it's somebody like Up Rocks or somebody else. They're rarely the actual 10 best whiskeys that you can get, but I want to see, I want to follow up on that, because I know, like I said, Whiskey Mutants are solid and legit. We'll see if these other ones actually are or not, but like I said, thank you guys for showing up tonight. We'll roll on over to the outro, and see you guys next week. Thanks for listening to the Embellish Podcast. If you like what you heard, make sure to subscribe. Check out our website at embellishpod.com and follow us on social media at Instagram and Twitter to keep up with what we have going on. If you have an idea about a story we should talk about, send it to us at embellishpod@gmail.com. And remember, whether famous or infamous, a good story mixed with a touch of embellishment makes the food you ate, the drink you drank, and the places you visited just a little more memorable.